But instead of talking about how to support all of our youth, especially our most vulnerable youth, people in my state, like Greg Abbott, have used their government power to pick on trans kids and get TV news hits about those kids' ability to play in sports. In my view, instead of spending our time picking on trans youth, we should be listening to them, bringing community together, figuring out how to solve the real challenges that our youth face, rather than angling for the latest segment on Fox News. I want to take a step back and think about the big picture of what we've been talking about in this committee hearing when we talk about trans youth participating in sports. Because when we're here at the seat of government in the US Capitol and we talk about young people, I think we should be talking about how we support them. And if anyone needs support, it's probably trans youth who are more likely to have faced bullying and isolation and doubt, and usually have a harder time than most of our kids. Instead of funding schools, supporting teachers or counselors or youth programs, I've got an extremist legislature singling out what we've been talking about today, a small handful of kids who are already suffering from pain with more pain. Because those families that I've met with and talked about, they know that when we spend our time in these seats of power talking about them instead of with them about these challenges, that creates even worse mental health issues, even more just really hard times for some of these families who are now questioning their own residency in my state. That's what we're dealing with here today. And so like any other athlete, trans athletes sometimes win, sometimes they lose, but in talking with a very small handful of them, they talk about how this is a chance at camaraderie, this is a chance at relaxation, this is a chance at teamwork. We should be focused on expanding opportunities for all of our young people and find ways to let kids be kids. So now for my questions, Ms. Goss-Graves, are you aware of any reason to believe that allowing trans athletes to participate in girls' athletics is limiting opportunities for cisgender athletes?
Absolutely not. In fact, there's a lot of gender inequity in sports and in schools. The trans athletes are not the source of it. They aren't the source of resource inequity. They aren't the source of not having the same level of coaching. They aren't the source of not opening up new sports teams when you have a group of girls who say, I just want to try playing lacrosse, and your school won't start a lacrosse team. Trans athletes are not the reason that we have gender inequity in sports, and they are not the reason that 50 years after Title IX was passed, its broad promise of addressing sex discrimination in education is still unfulfilled.
Thank you for that answer. And so, Ms. Goss-Graves, how could we, since we're in these seats of power, better support women's athletics and increase opportunities for girls and women who want to participate in sports?
There's a range of things that would be important. You could provide additional resources to schools, especially schools who have fewer resources to devote to sports. Oftentimes what we have found in areas where they have fewer resources, what they end up doing is investing hugely into male sports programs and deciding that they're not going to invest in female sports programs. You could also take action on the information that has come out about sexual abuse in sports. Abuse by coaches, by athletic trainers, by sometimes medical doctors. This isn't something that's coming out about trans athletes. It is about schools looking away from the harm that their employees are causing. There are a range of things. I'd be happy to work with you and with this committee on it.
So as Mr. Takano mentioned, the 4 trans athletes in Utah, it's not them that were caused the huge disproportionality in funding for men's sports versus women's sports. In fact, what you're saying here is it may not be trans athletes or isn't trans athletes taking opportunities away from women's sports. It might actually be guys like us on dioceses like this one not investing equally in women's sports. Actually, I have here an example from the Women's Sports Foundation saying that men received $252 million more in athletic scholarships than women in the years 2019 and 2020. A report released last year for the 50th anniversary of Title IX found that men's athletic programs received more than twice as many resources as women's athletic programs in 2020, and expenditures for recruiting and compensating head and assistant coaches favored male athletes about 3-1. So I want to enter both of those documents into the record. First, the May 2022 report from the Women's Sports Foundation titled 50 Years of Title IX. We're not done yet, so I'd like unanimous consent to enter that into the record, along with this report from 2022 from the NCAA titled The State of Women in College Sports. Thank you. So I think that this is a really important part of the question. One, how can we better support young people in general? And then second, if the claim is that by supporting trans young people and their mental health and their ability to be fully included in themselves, we're hurting women's sports, then we'll actually ask ourselves, what is actually hurting women's sports? And it might be the amount of scholarship money that many of us who were male athletes immediately had access to that women athletes didn't have access to, or the fact that many of us who are male athletes could participate in sports over the summer and in the fall semester and in the spring semester and do a second set of sports, and that you already had your uniforms paid for and you already had the ability to get state championships trips paid for. Maybe we could be talking about those things if we're going to be talking about sports. Ms. Goss-Graves, just to close here, how can bans on trans athletes participating in girls or women's athletics actually also harm those cis students?
Well, we've talked a lot about the sort of sex verification that we have seen, and that is how you prove, how states are requiring proving up that you are girl enough or woman enough to play. But I also just want to say this has been studied. The issue of trans exclusionary policies, sports participation for girls overall in high school declined in states that had trans exclusion policies. So when we are inclusive, everyone wins.
Wait, so you're saying where there have been more trans-inclusive policies, you've actually had more women participate in sports in those days?
That is correct.
Thank you. I yield back.
We are talking about opening up all women and girls to genital examinations when they are underage.
That's right.
Potentially just because someone can point to someone and say, I don't think you're a girl.
That's correct.
And we're saying this in an environment of a post-Dobbs America where states are criminalizing access to abortion and want nothing more than data on women to figure out when, who's getting a menstrual cycle, who doesn't have one. And we're supposed to believe that this is going to make us better and safer? I think not. And per usual, I don't believe we're sitting here in a panel of men that has actually thought about the biology and privacy consequences of all women, trans or cisgender here. Ms. Goss-Graves, in addition to that, are there certain groups more likely to face discrimination under these bans? When it comes to, and what you were speaking to, particularly when it comes to Black women and girls?
Yeah, we have seen that there are examples of Black women who are even professional athletes whose bodies have been more examined and demonized. We've seen that with my fan favorite, Serena Williams, whose body is often talked about. That sort of challenging them for who they are, if it is codified into law, is something that we would expect to see more.
And this also deeply intersects with a secondary issue, which is racial bias in the medical field. When we have vast proportions of populations that have been studied and tested are not racially or otherwise identity-based representative of the broader US population. And so what gets determined as a norm oftentimes gets pegged to largely white populations that have been studied, and then Black women and girls are then further subject to marginalization. This has been in your experience and what you've seen as well, right?
That's correct.
And so we're supposed to sit here on this side of the dais and to Ranking Member Lee's point, see a party that has voted against women's access to abortion, voted against our right, the Lilly-led Better Equal Pay Act, voted against the Violence Against Women Act, voted against our right to have access to contraception, and also doesn't even vote for equal funding, equitable funding in women's sports. And I'm supposed to believe that this is who's looking out for my best interests? I think not. And to that, I yield back.